House Colliery at Wakefield. 40 years ago there were about 180,000 miners working in 175 pits across Britain. Today there's virtually nothing left of the industry apart from museums like this one. But back then it was the livelihood for tens of thousands of families. Sometimes whole towns and villages depended on the pit for a living.
Between 1974 and 1983, some 60,000 miners lost their jobs. 36 pits closed between 74 and 79. 28 closed between 79 and 84. So you can see there's a dramatic attack on working class people's living standards.
So it was no surprise when in 1984, then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher announced the closure of 20 pits and the loss of 20,000 jobs, that it sparked the biggest industrial dispute in British history.
She was very determined to set out to use whatever force was required to attack the miners' strike, and very much provoked it in the way that she referred to the miners, for example, as the enemy within, drawing on the relationship that the 82 Falklands War, the Argentinians were the enemy without, and she made a kind of parallel comparison as if these miners were sort of very anti-British in their whole approach.
The Thatcher government set out to break the power of the traditional labour movement, starting when it was strongest, with the National Union of Mineworkers. What began as a walkout over jobs at one colliery began a year-long political struggle between the state and the organised working class. I was only at primary school at the time, but with me here is Dave, who was an activist during the strike.
In 1984, I was working in Leeds in a computer centre. I was a member of a trade union and I was already politically active. But when the strike started, my first thoughts were, how do we get to the picket lines? The first things we were doing was driving across from Yorkshire to Nottingham to get through the police lines. When that didn't seem possible because of all the problems of getting through to Nottingham, we started to spread the strike towards other areas like the power stations in West Yorkshire. So we got involved with something like power station workers, taking pickets to the Eggborough power station near here. But what was pretty obvious to me was there was a massive amount of support for the miners right across the country, but it wasn't being tapped. Solidarity was channeled into a very kind of charitable approach towards the strike, rather than a solidarity approach where we would go to other trade unions to bring other trade union members into the strike. And I think that was the victory of the 1970s, where the trade union movement could use all of its muscles across several different industries in order to bring the Heath government down. That didn't happen in 1984.
The National Coal Board has to close uneconomic pits. It always has.
But if the mine is not productive and the jobs are gone, then the people, what do they live on? How do they survive? How do they feed their families? And so, the fact of the matter is that defending working class people's lives and living standards requires a movement that says, well, that's not our problem. Our problem is the people we represent and their lives and their living standards and their mortgages and their families and their education and their future. And if this mine has to close, you have to provide us with alternative jobs, paying equally or better so that we can sustain our lives and our living standards. And that should be the very basic aspect of what a trade union should do. But unfortunately, they are far removed from that.
The trouble was the miners saw their role as defending the mining industry, and what it really needed was that broader understanding that it was the working class which had to fight together, that we all had a common interest.
The Plan for Coal, which was an initiative organised by the pits and the management of the mines, along with the trade union movement and the government. And the Plan for Coal was a way of making each mine or each pit a separate entity, involved in negotiating its own wage levels, its own productivity levels and so forth. So that had the effect of separating each mine from each other. And sort of we're very productive mine with higher wages, we're a lower productive mine with lower wages, and we've got to fight our battles on our own and you fight your battles on your own. And that was why the Nottinghamshire miners, for example, had a very different relationship to the NUM than to the National Union, than others. And so there was a kind of sense of, we solve our problems, we solve our problems. And the difficulty of bringing the whole union into one focused determination to win this struggle was reflected in the fact that the Nottinghamshire miners never striked in the first place, and everybody else was striking. And the trade union leadership of the National Union of Mineworkers failed utterly to win over the massive miners. Remember, the miners amounted to something like 185,000 people, almost double the number of police that were available to police the strike.
Do you think the government had a better sense of that wider struggle?
I think the Tories are 2 steps ahead of the trade union movement all the time, and they were fully prepared to win this battle. They had the police all ready to stop the pickets going across the border. They had stockpiles of coal. They were really prepared, and we all know that if things had got worse, they would have brought the army in. And so I think there were over 11,000 miners arrested during the miners' strike, 100 of which went to prison. They were determined to crush the power of organised labour, and the trade union movement had learnt nothing from 1974.
There is no precedent for the way the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher responded to the strike. You have to go back to 1926 or even before the First World War to see the levels of state coercion that were involved. And back then they used to use the military. 20,000 police were drafted into the coalfields. Every aspect of the state, special branch, MI5, riot squads, agent provocateurs, spies, mass arrests, stopping coaches in Kent from trying to get to the coalfields, the judiciary and the courts sentencing them to significant prison sentences, the sequestration of trade union funds wherever they could get hold of it. It was clear there was going to be no negotiations.
What we're doing is stopping people on the road, and we are, if you want to look at it, in total isolation and infringement of civil liberties. But let's look at what we are trying to do.
Very quickly, we were stopped on the motorways, so we used to find all the back roads to get through to Nottingham. And when the police blocked those off, we had to find new ways of getting through to get to the picket lines in Nottingham. So once we organised a minibus, and we recruited loads of women, female students from Leeds University, and we went through the police lines because the police were so sexist. They didn't actually think women would go to the picket lines. So that morning, I arrived with 12 women at a Nottingham pit, and we were the only pickets who got through that day. Other things we did during the miners' strike, we did a lot of collecting money for the pits around West Yorkshire. And again, the police were very involved in that. We were arrested several times for collecting money or putting posters up on bus shelters in support of the miners' strike. The police were pretty geared up from the outset.
We kept the men and the families from starving because they wanted to starve us, so we'd go back to work. But people didn't starve because we worked hard to put food on the table for them. We worked really hard. There were soup kitchens, so you could get a meal there if you wanted one. Children had a meal every day at school, so we knew they were fed. And our group did parcels. One particular woman, she'd be round knocking on doors and saying, "Look, we're doing parcels. Are you on strike? Here's something for you if you need it." She told me she came across this man and he just come to the door, and she said he just broke down and cried. His wife had left him because he was on strike and he would go back. She just left him with 2 kids, and he says, "With nothing to eat." Thank you. And just to come across somebody like that, stop them going back, it meant a lot. I was in Brands at the time, and then I had my badge, my hospitality badge it was, for making tea, cups of tea and coffee on the picket line, the miners on the, the oil cans filled up with the coal.
The miners weren't getting any strike pay through the miners' strike, so they had nothing, literally nothing, and money and food and other support was really important.
So what was it like being a woman of colour supporting a white male-dominated cause?
It was to be free of those categories. I felt I was a person showing solidarity. It was freedom, a little moment of freedom through solidarity. It was pretty close to a civil war, you know, roads were closed, the police were ordered to close down motorways. All that ranged against them. Public solidarity was enormously important.
Well, the miners enjoyed quite incredible support across the country. You know, there was a huge amount of working class solidarity taking shape in many different forms. Other workers at, you know, different facilities, like, for example, steel production, which relied heavily on coal, or electricity production, which relied heavily on coal. There were workers in those areas who were quite prepared to take what we call secondary action in support of the miners, in terms of not breaking picket lines. If one was established, say, at a steel yard in support of the miners, other workers wouldn't cross the picket line to go to work. And that was a generalized outlook throughout the kind of rank and file of the trade union movement. But I'm afraid the kind of activity and behavior of the trade union leadership across many of these other unions was one of restricting or redirecting or finding ways to limit the activity of their members, building a sense of fear about the viability of their own jobs, about possibilities of repercussions for the trade union. So trade unions were very afraid that if they broke the law, or if they got involved in secondary action, or if the courts acted against them, their funds and everything else could easily be found and extracted and taken away. And so they were very worried about the viability of their own unions.
It's hard for us to understand today how much that conflict just shook society and gave people the impression that there was a real war going on, and just the real impact it had on society.
The end result was this area around here was, massively, it's decimated the industries around here. It was a huge defeat for the working class when the miners lost. And I don't think that the working class movement has ever recovered for that, really, to this point. I think the end of the miners' strike is the end of an era in British political history. There's no doubt about it. It was the crushing of the mine workers, who were seen as the crack troops of the trade union movement, was a huge defeat, a defeat that they've never recovered from. And I think it's a watershed in British politics. It's never been the same since. Britain's a very, very different place from the 1980s.